Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Well, that was a great introduction. I kind of think it's downhill from here, but I'll do my best. Um, yeah. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I didn't know that Sackville actually had this many people, so I'm very impressed and kind of astounded. Um, I guess I was actually looking at the contract for my talk tonight, and I noticed that it said that it had an amount for under a 4-hour talk. And I was just thinking maybe I'll try and push it to get to the next premium. So we'll see. Although maybe I'm staying at the Marshlands Inn, and I think it's at like 9:40 they have free hot chocolate and ginger snaps. So I'm kind of weighing this out. I don't know. And then I actually, as I was having dinner in the lounge there, there was a song that came on, and one of the lyrics seemed maybe pertinent to this. It was, if you kiss a dollar bill, it doesn't kiss you back. So maybe I'll craft the talk appropriately, and I'll just see how it goes. Excuse me while I open this up. I should have done this before. So I'm going to open with, I'm just going to open by reading a quote by Thomas de Quincey from 1785. He's an English author and intellectual, probably best known for writing Confessions of an English Opium Eater. He wrote, oops, thank you. Someone told me quietly. I'll watch this for a second. Okay, he wrote, even the articulate or brutal sounds of the globe must be all so many languages and ciphers that somewhere have their corresponding keys, have their own grammar and syntax, and thus the least things in the universe must be secret mirrors to the greatest. Okay, so I'll put that aside for now, and you can sort of let that linger through the talk and see if it has any presence here or not. I'm actually starting by showing this work, which is a fairly recent work. It's less than a year old. And I'm showing it because it's a kind of way of working that I'm not really known for, actually. And I'm just sort of asserting a few things that may be dubious, maybe a little bit questionable. But one of the things that I want to sort of propose anyway, or at least for me to continue to think about, is that even though I'm kind of primarily identified now as a painter and a drawer, my thinking isn't necessarily bound by those disciplines. My thinking might extend beyond those disciplines. But those disciplines, I do seem to use them. I seem to work through them. I work my ideas through them, and they seem to be really beneficial for that work as well. So it's this kind of give and take with the discipline. This piece in particular is a very slightly assisted ready-made. It's just a hose I bought at Canadian Tire. It was coiled up. I stretched the coil out and nailed it to the wall. And that's all I did. So there are a few things that I'm interested in this work. And the other reason I'm showing this particular piece is that there are a few things that are of interest in it for me that sort of seem to thread through different iterations of my practice. So hopefully these various things will emerge as kind of themes. One of the things about this work is that it's just a garden hose, right? But I'm interested in how objects, things, materials can have multiple identities. Sometimes all at once, simultaneously, or sometimes they seem to shift and occupy different identities or transform from one thing to another. So this is just a hose, but it's also a line, right? And it's a line that's kind of making this looping pattern, kind of like a scribble. Or the way I think about it is I've got 2 younger children, and I watch them drawing. And I remember drawing as a child. And this is exactly the kind of drawing I would make to indicate writing. Right? I don't know if you guys feel that. Yeah, people are nodding. Good. Thank you. Thanks for nodding. I appreciate it. So now we've gone from a hose to a line to a drawing to writing. Okay? And writing is it's kind of infinite in its capabilities. It may have certain limitations in some ways, but it's also arguably capable of infinite expression as well. So I've gone from a hose to infinite expression. That's pretty good, right? You don't get that every day. So that's one thing I'm really interested about with this. And another thing is that related to that is a hose for me is it's associated with plumbing. And plumbing I associate with sort of baser bodily function. Okay, baser bodily function that's usually seeming to be supposedly lower on the totem pole, or the pole of hierarchies from where the intellectual operations might be at the top, right? But so it's this kind of banal thing, a hose. But then that possibility that it can speak to, as I described, language and all of language's capable possibilities for expression. And it's also this kind of looping form, so it suggests a continuity. It suggests kind of an infinite spinning or cycling. So I am thinking about ideas like the infinite. So I go from kind of the banal hose to the infinite, or to the sublime, perhaps. And for me, that does seem to be, it's not like a deliberate strategy in my work, although it's something more that when I look back at my work, I start to recognize. I was actually giving a talk at Guelph a number of years ago, and at the end of my talk, an English professor said, well, quite clearly your work is all about the sublime. Could you elaborate on that for us? And it just completely caught me off guard, because I hadn't known my work was all about the sublime until that moment, right? But yeah, quite often it does seem to be attached to interest or issues of the sublime. But I seem to, it seems to be, to me, kind of, well, I guess we should never say impossible, but for the sake of, just because I can't come up with a better word right now, it seems to be impossible to express or tackle an issue so crazily kind of rich and deep as the sublime head on. Okay? So it seems to me to be maybe possible to get there obliquely or kind of incidentally, unexpectedly maybe, through something banal. So that's often something that recurs in my work, that I deal with something that's banal, but I seem to be interested in pushing it and opening it up and seeing. I usually do expect that banal becomes a meaningless word, and I don't know, maybe sublime becomes a meaningless word and everything's somewhere in the middle. I'm not sure. The third thing about this work that might thread through different iterations of my work that I'll show tonight is that all of this stuff that I'm talking about, it only happens with the viewer, right? If the viewer allows it to happen. So when we look at a work of art, we engage or enter into a kind of cultural contract for viewing a work, for allowing it to function. So it's sort of like we agree to suspend our disbelief for a moment and allow it to function. We allow painting to do things. We allow, maybe, if you are willing, you allow a hose to express the infinite, right? So that sort of thing. I'm also showing this work to start off tonight because it's similar to older work of mine, which I'll go to now. And so I'll sort of jump back into the past, maybe jump back again a little bit, but then I'll start moving forward from there. So this is an installation I did for an exhibition called Lines Painted in Early Spring. It was curated by Patrick Mann and traveled around the country a fair bit. And this is an installation of a whole pile of extension cords, just all plugged in together to one another to create an endless, continuous circuit. So it's one large kind of loop. I was interested in the modernist idea of the autonomous artwork, and how with modernist work, everything that's important in a painting, say, or in a piece of work is said to happen within the frame, right? So it's not interested in its context, right? So I was interested in that. I think that's a beautiful idea. It's a wonderful possibility in a lot of ways, but I also think it's one that's been very rightly kind of challenged and critiqued too. So I wanted to play with that. So I got a whole bunch of these extension cords from my studio. So they were scuffed up, they were a bit dirty, and plugged them into one another and suspended them in a gallery space. So they reference this kind of formal play of line through the air, these cords twisting and writhing through the gallery. It's sort of like a three-dimensional Bryce Marden painting or something. And as I look at this, for me, I get kind of caught up in the lyricism of the gestures of the chords. And that becomes kind of everything for a moment. And I start following, say, a yellow chord as it snakes through the air. But eventually, I'll come to one of these plugs, these black plugs, where it's joined into another extension cord to carry on the loop. And that always is such a kind of literal moment of extension chord that I'm jarred out of that kind of whatever reverie that I might be in through following the gesture, and I'm back in the world again. So it's kind of constantly like playing that game where it lulls you or lures you into a kind of formal reading of the work and a formal experience of the work, but then it's also referencing outside itself. And again, as I said, the chords are kind of scuffed up, a bit dirty. Also, it traveled to a number of different galleries, so every gallery it went to, notably, it had to conform to the architecture of the space and to the architecture of the exhibition that it was part of as well. So it changed radically at every stop. It actually started also as I got used to installing it, and it's kind of like drawing in air with these chords. It grew bigger and it grew denser. So every place I went with this exhibition, I ended up running down to Canadian Tire or to Revy or somewhere like that and buying more and more extension cords and filling it up. Another thing that happened that was interesting to me, I'll show a couple of details of the work. Another thing that happened was that when I first started making these installations, I wanted the chords to do certain things. I thought, I can make the chord, go and do this kind of gesture or that. And I was kind of struggling with them, trying to bend them to my will. But I started to realize through the doing of these things that the chords, when they're coiled up and shipped from one gallery to the other, they're coiled in a particular way, and they've got a really excellent physical memory of that. They want to go back to that. And so it started to become, as odd and ridiculous as this might sound, it started to become more of a collaborative work for me. I was collaborating with extension cords, right? And so I learned to let them do what they wanted to do and just kind of sort of assist them. And then they did much more interesting things in the space. And the kind of gestures that started to emerge from that were ones that I wouldn't have ever made on my own, certainly. And sometimes they were really surprising to me. Sometimes they looked like a kind of cursive script, or they had a sort of cartoony aspect to them. And this actually came out of earlier drawings that I'd been doing, drawings where I'd taken appliances in my apartment and taken them apart and pulled them into pieces, looked at all the innards of these appliances, these common appliances that we use every day, but for me, I'd never really stopped to try and understand them at all or figure out how they might work. And so I pulled them apart and started drawing the insides of them with a really careful contour line, trying to record as much detail as I possibly could. In a way, it was a kind of vain attempt to understand them better and to gain some comfort with the technology that surrounds me. I did this with my television, for example. Drew a big picture of it, all the pieces of the inside of it. And, well, I was good at taking these things apart. I was never very good at putting them back together again. So I had to get a new TV after that. But what I found was when I drew with as much rigor as I could, trying to be as diligent as possible to get every single detail of the guts or innards of these appliances, the drawings actually became less readable, less usable to me. It was sort of the wealth of detail started to overwhelm them, and they became more abstract. So that was really interesting to me. So here's a drawing that came out of those drawings of the appliances and so on, where inside all the guts of these things there were often big bundles of wires and so on. So this one's actually a fiction, but it's very much built like those earlier drawings were. And it's drawn just with ballpoint pen and gel pen on paper. It's a little smaller than 3 by 4 feet. And I just started somewhere in the upper left corner, and I just started drawing. And again, I'm interested in the wires like the extension cords, being like each one is like this individual formal gesture. And the different wires have different characters to them. So some of them will sort of zip around quite quickly through the composition. If you're watching them, if you're following them with your eyes, it sort of takes you on a more high-speed journey through this tangle. Other ones meander much more slowly. So it was interesting. They each had this different kind of character. But even as there are these gestures which have a certain amount of immediacy to them, it was also important to me that I had really carefully contrived each one with twin contour lines. So these were contrived gestures, or they weren't so immediate as they might seemingly appear or appear to operate. And also, very much like the extension chords, they referenced outside the frame. I did try and keep, as the drawings went along, I tried to keep them all within the frame more and more as they went, to try and play up that kind of idea of the autonomy of the gesture and the artwork and so on. But I'll show a couple details of this. As you follow these wires around, inevitably you'll come to a moment where there's a moirette, like down here on the right, or up at the top where the wires are twisted together to complete a circuit, or over in the bottom left where bundles of these compound gestures are taped together with a piece of tape. And those more literal depictions of the moirette tape or the twisting wires, those things sort of jar you out again of that kind of understanding of this as a formal play, and it becomes representational again. So there's always this kind of push and pull in this work, it seemed, with exploring these boundaries between what might be called abstraction or what might be called representation. And this was kind of mind-numbing work, in a sense. It took, in my spare moments, whenever I got them at work, I had this at my job, and I'd sort of work on it whenever I could. And it took a year and a half to draw. And it's kind of like every wire, as you draw it, it's like this puzzle, right? Because you got to, it's all done in one shot with ink. So I had to make sure I left room for wires to pass over and under, as I was drawing these things around. I didn't want one wire to end up, the first one that I drew, for example, to end up just sitting on top on the surface. I wanted these wires not only to move around the two dimensions of the picture plane, I wanted it to go, them to weave in and out of that space too. So, but as I was doing that, it sort of occupies one part of your brain with a fairly intensive concentration, but it leaves a lot of the other faculties to sort of drift around. And so I did daydream a lot as well. And those individual wires that I was talking about that seemed to have different characters to them, they started to really acquire characters, and sort of narratives started to emerge, where two wires would sort of dance around each other, and then they'd come together, they'd wind around each other, intersect, and it was a kind of romance or something. And then they would go their own separate ways, and I'd actually feel sad as I was drawing. But I always had hope that they would meet again somewhere further in the tangle, that sort of thing. But what was starting to suggest itself to me, and as I reflect on this as well, is that there's a kind of, or there are many kinds of structures that are being played out here. And the wires themselves, if I'm thinking about them as individuals, then these are different kinds of social structures that are being formally played with and experimented and mapped on the surface. And so there's a way in which the formal gesture can be analogous to a kind of social structure or social dynamic. And I think that's something that's really interesting. I mean, I'm not going to delve into it in this talk, and it may not be so pertinent to my work in general, but it seems to be a really important way of thinking about, say, abstract painting today. So from that contour line drawing that I was doing for the wires, I was thinking about contour lines a lot. And contour lines are peculiar in a way that they have their own take on what reality is. They have their own version of reality that they uphold, say. And their version of reality is the physical reality, the reality of objects. Because the job of a contour line is to chart the edges of things in space. Right? That's what a contour line is. So I started thinking about testing this out and trying to find a situation where, in a way, that the contour line might be bound to fail. Because I wanted to think about what's a kind of reality that it can't deal with, maybe. So I started to think about these paintings that I'd been doing. And I started to use the contour line. I thought, what would happen if I used the contour line to draw the painting? Not to draw the picture in the painting, the image in the painting, but to actually draw the physical surface of the painting, like a contour line is supposed to do. So I started making these drawings of my own paintings. And the contour lines would chart every ridge and gully in the paint, and essentially map out every brushstroke that the painting was made with, and every bristle mark within the brushstrokes too. And it's sort of like those drawings of the appliances that I was talking about. these drawings of the paintings got so kind of densely formed and rigorous in terms of the detail they were paying attention to, that in many cases the image of the painting largely fell away in that kind of translation. And so it was kind of in a way, it was a cautionary tale about representation, because it was an intensely rigorous representation, but so much seemingly pertinent information was lost. But it was also, like, through translation, a lot's gained too, so it gave me a whole new way of understanding the structure of a painted representation. But I remember, like, waking up in the middle of the night one night with this thought, like, or two thoughts actually. Well, one was an image and one was a thought. I don't know, maybe an image is a thought. The image was of Bruegel's Tower of Babel, that painting. This painting, he's got two that are surviving. This, although this one isn't quite exact to his, because King Nimrod's been nixed from the foreground here. But I was thinking about Bruegel's Tower of Babel, and I was also thinking, well, when I do these drawings of paintings, I don't necessarily just have to draw my own paintings. I could draw other people's paintings. And so with those two sort of ideas, they immediately kind of stitched together. And I decided I would make a drawing of Bruegel's Tower of Babel. So this is the drawing. This is kind of what these drawings looked like. This is the first time, though, that my drawing, I didn't do it, the previous ones of paintings were done with just pencil line on paper, graphite line on paper. This one I wanted to do bigger. It's a monumental kind of subject, so I did it on primed canvas. I brought it back to the surface of painting, and I did it with a charcoal pencil. So there were a number of things I was interested in about the Tower of Babel in particular. I mean, it's a painting that I've always really been drawn to for numerous reasons. It's hard to kind of quantify. So I'm going to trip over my bag if I don't move it. At the time, George W. Bush was invading Iraq again, and Tower of Babel was supposedly this enterprise that was being built in Babylon, which is roughly located within Iraq. So there was a kind of a political aspect to the work, although that really wasn't my central concern, but it did give it some legs in the moment, I would say. But I was really interested in the story of the Tower of Babel. And so from the Old Testament, in the story, I'll give you a really crummy shorthand of it. The first people shared this common primary first language. And with this first language, there's this sort of theoretical implication that it was an immaculate language, that it was capable of absolute description, perfect description. So there was no gap between signifier and signified. What was said was precisely what was meant. And with that kind of power of complete and direct description or representation, it became possible in the story to build this tower that would reach up and put humans at the same level as a god. So that kind of power of that absolute description or representation that was capable in the language that was shared had that potential to lift humans up to that level. Of course, this was a sin for humans to place themselves at the same level as their god. So God had to do something about this. And this is also something that was really compelling for me about the story, is that rather than send, like if it were me, I'd just send a flood or maybe a big storm, a tempest that would just rip everything apart, right? But God didn't do that. God was much smarter than I am. And she sent, or he or she sent, or she didn't send, she made it so that everyone was speaking different languages. Right? And so that perfect, immaculate language broke down. People couldn't communicate, and the enterprise fell apart. Right? So Derrida and Foucault and others have written about this as a kind of symbolic birthplace of translation, because now with different languages, translation's necessary. It's also that point, if I was talking about the possibility of absolute representation, well, that doesn't exist anymore. And it's also the birthplace of the great, symbolically, the birthplace of the great cultural diaspora that's populated the globe, too. I was thinking about what I was doing with this drawing out of every brushstroke as a kind of charting the physical structure or the sort of foundational formal properties of painted language or painted representation, the way that a picture is built. And it occurred to me that when I hear somebody speaking a language that I don't know, a foreign language that I don't understand, to some extent, I hear everything they're saying. All the sounds are there. The pacing of those sounds is there, but the content slips away from me. And so it seemed to me that that's very similar to what I was doing with this drawing. I was drawing out all of the formal structure of the painted language, but the content was slipping away. Here's a detail from the base of the tower. Some pictures that I'm not showing tonight did evolve from doing this drawing. This drawing of the tower was, well, actually I did two versions, because the first version I'd never done drawing with on the prime canvas before, so I had to test different media. It was smaller than 4 by 5 feet, and I settled on the charcoal pencils, soft charcoal pencils, as being what I wanted. And this drawing's larger. It's 6 by 8 feet. I guess this isn't the best detail, but in moments in the architecture of the tower, which just stops a little more than or about a third of the way down the frame, that's the base of the tower right there. There are moments in the architecture where the brushwork or my tracing of it started to appear like written language as well. And it was also, the whole picture was made by gridding off my earlier study that I showed at first and translating it onto a grid on the canvas. And without thinking about it, I just, in my old Western way, I started at the top left corner and worked across, right? So it was very much like writing again. But the scale of this mark making, as the brushstrokes got bigger on this surface and also on the textured surface of the canvas, they started to really look like musculature. So I started to think about what I was doing was like drawing the anatomy of a painting. So there's a work that I'm not showing tonight, but it's based on an anatomy picture by Thomas Eakins, this operation. And it's really, that's where it sort of came from. This is another work that I did. This is a Tom Thompson sketch called Wild Geese. I first encountered this picture in Museum London's gift shop on a card, you know, on the rack there. And it was funny. I sometimes, but very rarely, have these kinds of moments where I looked at this image on the card, and this isn't, you know, this isn't a piece I'd ever known before. It's not a very well-known Thompson sketch. But immediately I knew I wanted to work with it. It's kind of like somewhere in the back of my brain, I'd been waiting for this. I don't know, waiting for this. But it wasn't the lake and the hills behind and so on. It was really the geese in the sky that were what I'd been waiting for. And I was really immediately struck by them. That they're, when you look at them at all closely, they don't really look like geese. Thompson's just taken these really cursory kind of marks with the brush and just laid them very quickly into the sky in the formation of geese, and so they do the job quite convincingly. But they're just these little blobs of paint, and that really interested me. How can these little blobs of paint have anything to do with a goose, right? A goose, a bird flying, pretty remarkable thing. But not just that. For me, right away, instead of wild geese, these little blobs of paint, I thought of them immediately upon picking up the card as Canada geese. So they became kind of national emblems in effect. And also, because it was a Tom Thompson painting, Tom Thompson as this heroic, mythic Canadian outdoorsman artist, it gave, you know, his brushwork seemingly has much more cultural significance than many others anyway. So all this stuff was going on for me in those geese. There was something else I wanted to say about this, but I can't remember what it was. Oh well, doesn't matter. So this time I got to, there was another reason why, another thing that was intersecting here for me was this was in Museum London in Ontario, and I just moved to Ontario to teach at the University of Western Ontario. And I'm from Vancouver, and I grew up there, and I've never really felt Canadian. Because anything west of the Rockies to me it's not really Canada, it's something else, it seems like. I always felt like I was kind of missing out growing up out there. So being in central Canada, finally it felt like I'd kind of crossing the Rockies, coming that way. I'd entered Canada finally. And, like it was confirmed for me because, every second person was wearing a Ty Domi jersey with the big blue maple leaf on it. And I was feeling really Canadian. All the cars in the traffic in London, they all had the Tragically Hip blaring. It was Canada, right? And so what better time and place to pay tribute to the kind of roots of Canadian paintings, or some of the roots. So I got access to the painting in Museum London, in the vaults, and I was able to work from Thompson's sketch. And you can see, like, relative to the Tower of Babel, which was my own translated painting of Bruegel's, so my own brushwork, Thompson's brushwork is radically different to mine. And so when I drew it out, it had a very different kind of feel and effect. So I did this drawing first, but this overall drawing of his sketch wasn't really my real interest. As I said, I was interested in the geese, these geese up in the sky. So then I did it. This is a detail of the first drawing, but I did another drawing after this where I just took the geese out of their context and redrew them in formation on these two sheets of paper. I enlarged them quite a bit. So this is just over or around 8 feet wide, the two sheets of paper together. And I raised the piece of paper on the right and let the bottoms free from the wall so that they'd curl up a little bit, just to give this sense of lifting and flight, right? So these geese in flight. It seemed quite absurd and ridiculous to me, and I wanted it that way. I wanted these little odd marks to really kind of have, to pull them as far away from geese as I could get and see what would happen. See how far away I could remove these little blobs of paint from the idea of goose, or from the idea of Canada goose, and see like how far I could pull it before that connection broke, right? But in a way, well, actually, I'll show you. I got to show this work in a number of different places, but I eventually did get to show it in Museum London itself, where they own the Thompson sketch. And so I was able to show it with the Thompson sketch over there on the left, which I quite like. This is the only time I've ever shown my drawings of paintings with the painting that they're drawn from. I've usually avoided that because I don't want it to devolve into a kind of game where, you go to a drawing, you find a brushstroke, and then you go and see if you can find it in the painting. And I didn't really want to weight the work on the process to that extent. But this was kind of irresistible to show with Tom Thompson, I guess. What can you say? So, but this drawing here that I did of these geese didn't seem for me to take the idea far enough. So I ended up doing these drawings on the right. This is as we're swinging around the space to get a little bit of a sense of the installation. And here's a portion of these drawings that were made from the earlier drawing. So there are these sort of stages, these different iterations of this project. So in this case, I took each little, what putatively was a brushstroke from the original Thompson study that was then translated into my first drawing, that was then translated into my second drawing, and now I've enlarged them again and translated them, but separated them out onto their own piece of paper, and then framed them. And I tried to enlarge them to get them roughly to goose size, actually. And then displayed them back into, they're framed, so they're these individual things. But then I repositioned them and put them back into that original passage that they were from, that section of the geese in flight. Chris actually wrote a really nice review of this show. And there's a phrase you used, Chris, that I always bring up because I really like it. I think you described these as being terse linguistic units. Which yeah. What's that?
That was me?
Yeah, I think so. I've been crediting you with that for a long time. But what was really interesting to me was that these drawings, as they went through these different processes, they started to gain a character of their own. They almost started to become animated. They seemed to have, their own life. And, I mean, that doesn't really look like a goose to me, but it became its own thing. But it seemed alive to me, actually. They seem to have a kind of life to them. And that life is, for me, it seems to be, I don't think it's a metaphor, actually. I think it's actually some sort of an embodiment of this intersection between what was just this inert material of paint that Thompson just sort of dashed onto the surface of the side of his flower crate, and this idea of Tom Thompson as this mythic figure, and the idea of a national emblem like a Canada goose, and just the idea of a goose itself, and all that kind of cultural significance these marks have been invested with as an historical artifact. Yeah. All those things seem to intersect and animate this strange drawing for me, bring it to life. But again, at this point, I would say that this only has anything to do with a goose or anything to do with Tom Thompson or anything to do with any of that stuff that I was talking about if the viewer allows it to have anything to do with them. So it does require a kind of willing viewer to invest that in it and allow it to actually sort of come to life. So I'm a pretty willing viewer, but maybe the most willing. But here are some more. This one, the geese were flying from left to right. This one always, to me, looked like it was flying backwards. I don't know, but that's the right way around. And this is the last one I'll show of these, but this one always, to me, rather than a goose, it more looks like a turkey. I don't know. Does anyone else see that? No? So I've been doing these drawings of paintings for a while, and I'm still, I haven't done some for a little while now, but but I'm planning more. It's still a way of working and thinking that I like to engage in. But a lot of the conversation around these works seemed to really rest on the process through which they were made and all the decisions I made, like how did I decide to use this width of charcoal? What was my thinking around that decision and so on. So these are the kinds of questions I would get, all good questions. And a lot of the conversation revolved around that and the idea of deconstruction, that I was deconstructing paintings, pulling them apart, right? And which is all fair, and I think that's all absolutely part of the work and was intended to be, as much as I can control these things. And it's important to the work, I think. But for me, ultimately, maybe the most important thing about the work is that it offers a kind of an experience for the viewer. So it's not merely about the process through which it was made, although that's all part of this. It gets tangled up in this experience that it might offer to a viewer. But all this deconstruction of a painting was a kind of way to make a picture in this case, to create a viewing experience. Maybe a kind of new proposition, which I think this strange goose-like creature is, or turkey, or whatever. So I wanted to kind of, in subsequent works, I wanted to redress that balance, to try and make the work more immediate, less about the process, or to dwell less on the deconstruction, and to dwell more on the kind of construction. So I started to, well, one of the earliest pieces I did to try and redress that was the next piece I'll show you, which is a painting of snow falling. And it really follows the exact same process as the drawings. So I made a small painting that was 8 by 10 inches, and then I just, rather than drawing out every brushstroke, I repainted every brushstroke, but much bigger. So it became 6 by 8 feet, this painting of snow falling. And I'd seen a J.E.H. MacDonald painting. I don't know for sure, actually, now if it was a J.E.H. MacDonald painting, because I can't really remember the painting itself. But just for conversation's sake, I'll say that it was. And it's, again, sort of like the Thompson one, beautiful little painting, but not one of his most remarkable, I would say. But what captured me about this one painting was it was an urban landscape, a snowy landscape, a winter urban landscape. And it was really apparent that he had painted the streets, the people, and the snow on the ground, and the sky and everything, and that it had dried. And maybe he had thought that he had finished the painting at that point. I don't know the story behind it. Maybe it was planned all along. But at some point later, after it was dry, he came back to it and decided it should be snowing. So he painted little snowflakes all over this painting. And I can tell just by looking at the painting that this was done well after the fact of the first stage, because when paint is layered over a surface that's already dried, it just has this really obvious appearance to it. It's dragging across the surface rather than sliding into the wet paint of a surface. And so in that moment, it struck me as really kind of odd and interesting, because what it did was it separated two ideas or two ways of thinking about painting. One was, in the original scene, he was using paint to create this illusion of space or represent something. And that's a kind of a way of thinking about painting where you're asking your viewers to forget what they're actually looking at, to forget the flat surface and forget the paint, and to invest in this imaginary space. But then when he put these little snowflakes on it and they sort of dragged over the surface and sat right on top, that was a more literal application of paint. Essentially, he was painting onto a painting. It's almost like, to overstate the case, he was vandalizing a work, right? And those little touches of paint on the top, even as they were fairly successful as snow falling at one moment, they also really asserted themselves as literal touches of paint on the surface. So that separated a very different way of thinking about paint as literal stuff. So I was interested in playing with that. So in my smaller sketch that this is from, it's like I said, 8 by 10 inches, the little touches that made the snowflakes in it were a little bit uncomfortable in the way that I just talked about MacDonald's painting. But not too bad. They, on the smaller scale, they seem to be fairly comfortably translated into snow. But then when it got enlarged like this, they became, it's sort of hard to see in this image, but they were quite thick and blobby things. And they started to assert themselves as something a bit strange. So something kind of not necessarily part of the picture entirely. And I was sort of ready for them to kind of destroy the painting in a sense, to challenge and undercut that illusory representational space that I developed in this strip mall parking lot. And they did that in a moment. You know, when you look at it in one way, there's a painting with blobs all over it. Like the blobs sort of tell you that this is a flat surface. It's not illusory. It doesn't go back. And it just interrupts that kind of imaginary space. But then what really surprised me was at another moment, these literal blobs of snowflake paint that were scattered over the surface, they actually seemed to almost oddly kind of start to hover or float out in front of the painting and actually kind of increase the depth of that representational space. And there was something really weird going on where the materiality of the paint that was representing the snowflakes somehow started to get confused with the materiality of actual snowflakes. So anyway, this was an early piece, so it's sort of just starting to happen here. But I wanted to push that idea. So I did a number of other pictures, but I started to make pictures of people smoking. And I wanted to really push this strange kind of contest the paint was having with itself and see, you know, how absurd or strange it could get. I did basically these paintings, these portraits of people smoking were just gathered online. I just Googled in an image search people smoking, and I got a whole bunch of images, and then sorted through those images. And for whatever reason, certain images on a certain day would kind of float to the top, and I'd be really interested in painting that person's portrait. And then I covered these portraits with these big blobs of paint or smoke. And I did these again. They were small paintings that I remade into these larger ones. These larger ones aren't that big. They're 36 by 28 inches. So here's a girl smoking. And again, although it's more difficult, there's a moment where these great big gray blobs of paint are seen as like splattered over the surface and destroying or obstructing the portrait. Just recently, I was at a show with one of my works in it, and I saw this kid. I don't know, he must have been about 10 years old or something. He was reaching up He was grabbing onto one of these chunks of paint, right? It was like a climbing hold. I couldn't blame him because it was kind of irresistible, right? Like I kind of, after I saw him do that, I kind of thought, oh, I might like to try that too. Like you get a good grip on it. But he was trying to pull it off the painting because he thought it shouldn't be there and he wanted to see what was behind it, right? So that's the sort of sense these things have. But then at the other moment, or at another moment, if you're willing to allow it to happen, it's sort of like a Necker cube, how it sort of collapses and goes one way or comes out the other way. If you kind of like willfully make the paint become smoke, you can do that. And again, like those snowflakes, it starts to actually float out in front of the painting a little bit. And the movement of those blobs of gray paint that Gary Michael Dalt for the Globe and Mail described them as gray fried eggs, which I really like. It's the best description of them yet. But they kind of, their movement, if you will, it sort of seems to be drifting out, like it would drift out of the picture frame. And it's interesting because the representational space of the picture, which you have to invest in and imagine as that portrait or that sitter is actually behind the picture frame, that space it draws in. So there's a kind of different movement there. But that's what starts to happen when the blobs of paint become smoke. But they're so absurdly blobs of paint that you can't really hold it there for very long and it kind of collapses down again. And so you have to like make it into smoke again as you look at it. And for me, that's like something that's really crucial about this painting is the viewer recognizing their role in it, in transforming paint into smoke. And that's a pretty remarkable thing, that I would say that we have this kind of collective will. If we choose to do it, we can make this inert material, which is just ground up minerals and oil, just kind of essentially like a mud, right? We can transform it into smoke, something kind of like fleeting, ineffable a bit. There's a magic there, I think. It's not magic that I'm producing, it's magic the viewer produces or allows to happen. And it's a magic that's contained in the possibility of the work. This is a golfer. So I was really interested in that idea, but this is a subsequent series of smokers that I wanted to kind of push that idea further again. So in this case, the paintings essentially really look the same. They seem to operate in the same way, but the Google image search that I did was for, I did, again, people smoking, but this time I added a qualifier of a discipline. So, it might be a neurologist like this fellow. Here he's a neurologist smoking, or a philosopher smoking, or a physicist smoking, a cultural anthropologist smoking, these sorts of things, a priest smoking. And so my thinking was that, okay, we can magically transform one material into another. We can transform paint into smoke. But we can also maybe transform paint, or paint can actually, at our behest as viewers, it could become the embodiment of ideas or a way of thinking, right? So I was thinking that the neurologist has a particular worldview that's different from the cultural anthropologist or from the philosopher, probably. So that's what for me, these ridiculous blobs of paint, not only do they magically become something they're not, but they also become like ideas or concepts. So this is a slightly more illustrative version of what I'm talking about. That's actually the bald pate of a philosopher's head at the bottom, and the smoke's drifting up as though they're like thoughts or ideas, right? And here the smoke has drifted free from the portraits. So maybe it's not even smoke anymore. So now the paint it's open to whatever possibilities you want to project there. So I would think that, one thing that I was thinking is that I use the word magic, but the magic is not in the object. It's not in the realm of art, per se. It's just this magic that resides in us if we are willing to transform one thing into another, that we actually can kind of do that, if we want to believe in that. So it's this, I think that We do that all the time, right? As we're walking down the street, we're applying like concepts to everything we see. We're applying language to it. We're transforming it and understanding it in particular ways that we've been trained to understand it, right? So we've been trained to understand certain possibilities or potentials for paint. Painting and art is just this kind of microcosm of the world in general. It's just this kind of, it's a little easier in art sometimes to figure out what's going on, because it seems, as complex as art is, it seems there are probably fewer variables than the everyday out there in the world. So what am I going to show next? Oh, I guess after I taught at Western, and then I taught at the University of Guelph, and then I moved back to the West Coast, back to Vancouver, back sort of home. So it was inevitable that at some point, rather than making snow paintings, I would make paintings about rain. So these pictures of rain, which I'll show a few of, they came about, really they first started by looking through the windshield of my car, rain-splattered windshield of my car at figures out in the streets and things. And I started getting fascinated by this, so that I was a real hazard on the roads, really, because I didn't want to turn on the windshield wipers, right? Because I was so interested in these droplets that I was looking through, this screen. And here it's very much like the snow picture or something like that, where these blobs of paint on the surface, or the smoke paintings, where these blobs of paint on the surface can become like droplets of water. There are a number of differences maybe, though, or peculiarities here, where droplets of water are clear. So I'm asking these sort of clotted blots of paint to, I'm asking the viewer to imagine them to be clear. I'm also imagining that they're like raindrops or droplets of water. They're like little lenses, right? They refract everything that's around them. So they contain kind of, they're like little worlds in and of themselves, right? So here's this possibility for paint, like this possibility of kind of containing everything if we want to project that into them. I don't know if it's how obvious this is in this picture, but if you look at all the sort of white blobs in these blobby droplets, you can see that it's the figure upside down inverted in them. So they're like all these little worlds where there's this figure upside down moving around in them. It also struck me as that these were like little abstract paintings within a painting. So these are like little interruptions in this scene. So the way that these pictures were operating was that still I would do a smaller painting and repaint it and enlarge it, so that, you know, the painting itself that the viewers then see is this larger version. All the brushwork has like it asserts its immediacy as physical, its physical immediacy. But it's also like heavily mediated at the same time. It's gone through this kind of ridiculous process. But there's this kind of silly, rational process at work here. The idea being that, okay, say if the plan is that we want to understand painting better, let's put it under a magnifying glass. Let's enlarge it so we can see it more clearly, know it better. But as I enlarge it, it gets sort of stranger, or these gaps open up in it, or the paint becomes unmanageable a bit. And so, in my way of thinking, to quote Jorge Luis Borges, it's opening up crevices of unreason. I like that phrase for it. So I'm using this kind of rational process of representation and zooming in and enlarging, right? Which, you know, sort of makes sense. If you want to study something, that's a good idea. So it's this kind of like rational approach, but I'm kind of pushing it to the absurd level. So it's sort of like this, it actually becomes kind of hyper-rational. And then it becomes maybe irrational in the end, or it leaves me with something that's kind of unknowable. So this is a detail of one of those droplets from that painting. So we get these strange things. So these are like the droplets in that more representational scene were these little abstract paintings hovering in this space. Here I'm taking it all together out, and it performs at first glance like pure abstraction, I would say, or as close to pure abstraction maybe arguably as you can get. But it really isn't abstraction at all. It's this kind of hyper-representation at the same time. I always think that actually representational painting is incredibly abstract. Like, I mean, it's ridiculously abstract. It's strange that we have these kinds of divisions and that we think about abstraction as being so different from representation. Because, I mean, just to, even on the level of like plotting a three-dimensional time-based reality onto a flat rectangle, like, it's pretty weird, right? That's a huge abstraction. Right? Anyway, because these droplets were sort of containers of everything that was around them, they seem to have this reference to the infinite. So again, we get through this kind of just this banal thing like a raindrop on a windshield, and we get to this kind of idea of the infinite or the sublime. So here's from a recent show at the Equinox Gallery. I showed some of the detailed droplet paintings near to the pictures they had come from, just to give a kind of that sort of chain of events. But here I've sort of reversed the order. The painting on the left is what I sort of think of as one of the in-between pictures. It's not like zoomed right in onto a singular blobby droplet. It's sort of halfway in between, so it's got more readable representational moments, but it's kind of hovering in this kind of no man's land in between somewhere. So there it is. And here's another example of where two were hung together. So the painting on the right is a droplet that came from the painting on the left. Painting on the left is just this figure walking with a blue umbrella on the side of the street. So again, a very banal scene. And for me, it's not just that these abstractions came from the representations, so that the abstractions are actually, as I describe them, a kind of hyper-representation. It's actually, for me, it also goes the other way, and it suggests that the representational moment is also highly abstract. And so our whole version of reality, the reality that we inhabit, that we kind of believe in as being fact, it's all this kind of, for me, it's all this abstraction. It's built from our own investments. Here's the painting on the right. These ones I titled Untitled, comma, Detail, and then in brackets I'd give them a title. So this one was called Untitled Detail, What We Want and What We Get. This is also a detail from that same picture that the previous one came from. This is, again, one of those in-between kind of paintings. This is called, I guess this one wasn't called Untitled, it was just called Detail, Fallen Stars in the Coffin Deep. I started giving them these poetic titles to suggest some other kind of way of knowing things, or way of knowing the pictures, or way of knowing reality, or thinking about things. Here's an image of part of the exhibition where the droplets themselves were just isolated. So they were able to operate more autonomously as kind of abstractions and open to further possibilities that way, untethered from the representations that they came from a bit. And stranger, right? Stranger as a result. This one's called Beyond Me, the Earth Will Roll in the Heavens, which is written by Georges Bataille, surrealist philosopher, poet. And he wrote a whole bunch of fragments that never really became poems. And that's one of his fragments. Actually, Beyond Me, the Earth Will Roll in the Heavens. That's actually the title of the hose piece I showed at the beginning. I can't remember what this one's called, but something really good, I think. This one's untitled, and then brackets, detail of a painting that no longer exists, because the painting got painted over, actually, later on. But by titling it a detail of a painting that no longer exists, it becomes like kind of, as a viewer, you'll never know what that painting that no longer exists was. So you can imagine anything you want. So it becomes like open to much broader possibilities. In all of this, when the viewer is, like, this is a strange thing, right? For me, these are strange pictures. But I like this idea that we can invest them, again, with certain sets of possibilities, right? And if they can become significant, or if they can become attached to an idea of something, say, infinite, or even just the idea of a raindrop or someone walking down a street, that's pretty fantastic for me. And I think that more so, though, the kind of recognition that hopefully the viewer has, that they're the ones that control that transformation, that the viewer has that degree of agency to transform one material into another, to transform a material into the embodiment of an idea. And then hopefully that the viewer has that agency to do that and carry that kind of thinking into their other spheres of life, right? Because that's what we always do. We make our own world, and how we choose to present it or think about it or see it. This one's untitled detail, and then in brackets, efficiently unknown, is our own internal skeleton. I started painting the details on burlap as well, because as I was enlarging the brushstrokes, I was also really needing to enlarge the canvas that those original brushstrokes were on. So I needed a coarser weave to account for that. And this one's titled Untitled Detail, and then in brackets, even the articulate or brutal sounds of the globe must be all so many languages and ciphers that somewhere have their corresponding keys, have their own grammar and syntax, and thus the least things in the universe must be secret mirrors to the greatest. And that's the quote I opened the talk with. So we kind of come around full circle in this kind of endlessly spiraling thing. I hope it didn't feel too endlessly spiraling to you. And then that really was supposed to be the last picture. But I just show a picture just from my studio, a recent picture of that I'm still working. And these are more of these kinds of evolving, strange detail forms from paintings happening here in the corner. And then on the left, there are a couple of these shaped panels with burlap stretched over them. So far, I've got like 5 different shaped panels like that. The shapes come from Jean Arp constructions. I found a book in the Emily Carr University Library with different Jean Arp constructions in them, and I pulled out the shapes, enlarged them, and made these panels. And it's for a project that's going to be reinstalled in the Emily Carr Library, up one of their big walls. And then the result, I think they're just going to be, I don't really know what's happening with these yet. I'm still trying to sort of figure it out as I go through it, but I think they'll be painted a pale yellow, sort of monochromatically pale yellow, and will disperse up this wall as if they're floating. One thing about the Jean Arp forms was they've been described as being, as having a kind of an autonomy, not referring to anything in particular in the world, as much as they're kind of amoeba shapes, I know, but this is how they were thought about. But then when they're installed together in Jean Arp's constructions and so on, they create these kinds of constellations of associations, it's described as. So they start to sort of define and create their own networks of meaning and reference just amongst themselves. So I'm thinking of that as these things will be floating up the wall. And then I'll take the final, I think what I'm going to do is take the final configuration of them on the wall and trace each shape out relative to all the others in formation, shrink that down, and then I'm going to look for a text in the library to trace them over top of. The text that I'm thinking of right now is an essay by Georges Bataille called The Rotten Sun, which is about people who stare up into the sun until they lose their vision. So there's something to do about this connection between the language of the writing in that text and this experience of viewing the physical objects that are paintings, and yeah, something about that intersection or about that difficulty of that intersection where maybe the language and the experience of viewing maybe don't quite fully meet. I think that's everything. Yeah. So thank you. If there are any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Yeah. Yeah, this is, it's all oil paint on canvas. I do now, to sort of stabilize the paint, I'll mix in some wax medium, cold wax medium. It helps especially when the paint gets really thick. If I was using straight oil paint, there are problems where what happens is that when it's in a really thick volume or heavy volume of paint, the paint will dry with a skin over the surface, but the inside will be all gooey and wet. And conservators tell me that my paintings will take about 15 years to actually dry properly. So what happens as the paint inside dries, if it doesn't have the wax in it, it loses volume. So you get the skin that's dried over one volume, but then the volume inside shrinks, and it starts to pull that skin of paint and pucker it. And when it starts to wrinkle like that, that's called pre-cleavage, apparently. That's a technical term for before it starts to crack and then break and fall off the picture. So yeah, it's essentially oil paint, but with some wax medium mixed in. I really don't know. I mean, I think the wax medium probably speeds it up quite a bit. The weird and nice thing about the wax is that it sort of starts to set up through the body of the paint evenly. It's actually funny because the surface of the paint stays wet far longer than if the wax wasn't in there, but the whole blob is getting more and more solid. And so by the time it's hardened on the surface, it's still a bit soft, but it's not nearly as soft as the blobs were when I wasn't using the wax. Yeah. I think when I was about 10 years old, I remember seeing this documentary on TV, and it was on the Group of Seven, and it was the Group of Seven comes west, and they were in the Rockies, and they were painting. And I remember just like, for me growing up, my family's idea of the height of art was Robert Bateman. They even took me to a Robert Bateman show on Lonsdale in North Vancouver, and well, he was great. He was so nice, and he was fantastic. I loved him. But yeah, like I remember seeing this documentary, and this one moment where the camera did do a close-up. It zoomed in on a painting. It's a painting of a mountain peak, and it was so clearly done with 2 strokes of paint, 2 strokes of the brush in thick paint, and that just struck me right then and there. And it was that thing. It wasn't that it was. I don't know that I would characterize it exactly as it's an. Well, see, for me, it became the mountain. It was absolutely, utterly convincing as a mountaintop. But at the same time, I knew it was paint. It's true. But that's what I was trying to say with the hose at the beginning. It actually had 2 identities at the same time. Right? So it wasn't that it was paint pretending to be something. It was paint and it was a mountain peak, both at the same time. That may have been just exactly what you said. Sorry. Sometimes I take a while to catch up. But yeah, again, it's like that kind of, we've learned to walk to an art gallery if we want to experience art. Like that seems like a logical place to go. We've learned to walk up the stairs, open the door, and walk into the gallery space. And I've learned that, that gilt frame over there tells me that I should look within its frame, and I see this surface that's covered with dried paint, and I kind of know how I'm supposed to understand that. And all these things that I choose to accept, they allow for that possibility, for that moment where the paint can become the mountain peak at the same time. Right? So that's something that's what I mean when it's like, it's our collective decision to buy into that and then allow it to happen. And for me, then it does absolutely happen. But it's just like anything, walking down the street. How the sidewalk becomes the sidewalk because I know it as such. I've learned it to be such, so I project that. Right? It's everything. Every little detail of life is like that. Well, that's a really good question, and I don't really have a clear answer for that because I've never decided that any of the zooming has stopped yet. But it does seem that like this most recent show, I zoomed into these blobs. I'd never zoomed in that much before, right? So I don't know, it seems like a logical place because it becomes this strange autonomous thing. So now it's like it can have its own life that could be completely independent of its source. If I just show this painting all on its own, and viewers come to it and don't know where it's from, it can have a totally different read or meaning or position. So this seems like a kind of logical point there where it's potentially broken that tether in some respect. But with knowledge of that procedure of how it got here, we can choose to pay attention to that. And that can be present too. So right now, this is a happy moment for me. I like this place. I could imagine, I'm not going to say that I won't zoom into that further. There are probably parts that are interesting there, but I don't know. It might not be interesting, then I won't do it. It's actually, my whole talk tonight really has been, if I've been sort of describing what I do as, I'm a ridiculously over-rationalizing person, right? So I overthink everything, and I try and make sense of everything, even as I know sensibly that I can't make sense of everything. I still try. I still have this kind of need to do that. So what I've done, and I've sort of tried to show, is that I've kind of tried to create processes that trip my rationalizing brain up or interfere with my process so that something other will happen. So that the rationalizing will kind of collapse under its own logic or weight. So the truth of it is that as I give this talk, this is me rationalizing all of what's going on. I've just told a big story here tonight, right? So I don't know when I'll stop or what's a good time to stop. These things happen, and I kind of have to try and deal with it. And I usually spend a long time worrying over that and trying to figure it out after the fact.